Hey everybody, welcome back to a new episode of Jägerhorn. Today's a bit of an unusual one because I'll be doing some backstage stuff, which is something that I haven't really done in Jägerhorn so far, and normally it's something that I do in the same episodes, or at least the times that I have done some backstage stuff before, I would do it in the same episodes as I'm building the facades. But for Jägerhorn, I did all of the facade work and kept all of the backstage stuff for a separate episode, which is also kind of interesting because it means that this whole episode I'll be building things that'll be invisible from the park itself. So really, when you think about it, all the things that I'm doing here shouldn't matter, but I think they do, and I think it's actually quite important to build these areas. For one, this is a game and you're not always looking from the perspective of a guest, and from the perspective of me, an omniscient being in this world who is making this theme park, seeing these backstage areas from an aerial perspective, seeing that these flimsy facades are actually just the front of a real concrete building, it just adds to the suspense of disbelief that this could be a real section of a real theme park somewhere out there in the world. And I don't know, I think for me at least that's quite important. And even as a guest and looking from a guest perspective inside the park, I think having these supposedly invisible backstage structures is actually quite important, insofar as they're not going to be 100% invisible, because you're going to see things that hide these things from plain sight. And I think that's the thing that sort of grounds this park in reality if you're looking from the perspective of a park goer, if you're looking from the guest's perspective, because you can see all of these walls and the trees and the detailing that covers up these backstage areas. So for that reason, I think it makes sense to build things that you don't see and to build things that you're hiding, because the very fact that there are things that you're not supposed to see and that are supposed to be hidden is kind of a touch of realism in and of itself. So yeah, that's my little philosophical deep dive into the reason why building backstage areas for theme parks is a good thing. Generally speaking though, only if you're building parks like this that are very heavily themed and have backstage areas of some kind, which is similar to real life parks like Disney parks or Universal parks, or even parks like Fantasyland to a limited degree. But of course not every park will do things like this. I think if you look for instance at the Efteling, a lot of the buildings there are a bit more real, but even then they're not entirely real, and especially for dark rides and restaurants you'll find backstage areas that don't look quite as fancy as the front facades, for which the main reason is really just saving money. If there's a good reason not to build the entire buildings the way that the facades look, is just that all of that detailing and everything costs a lot of money. Not to mention that all of these facades use interesting roof textures and shapes, and really most backstage areas of buildings have flat roofs, which is just cheaper and more convenient. And really these backstage areas, these backstage buildings are just sheds that a real stage would be placed inside. So it's kind of like a commercial building or a shopping mall in that sense, that it's really just a little outside cover to cover a themed stage inside. Now there are some important elements of these buildings though that I do want to point out. For one, there's this little roof here that I'm decorating maybe a little bit too much, but I thought it would be fun to at least decorate it, which is the side of the staff room. If you have staff in a theme park, I mean, I guess technically you can't really run a theme park without staff now, can you? But you're gonna realistically need some rooms for staff to relax in and take their breaks, which is all mandated by whatever laws in whatever part of the world you are. So might as well give them a good staff room and an outside area where they can sit. So that's what I'm working on here. But then a lot of the backs of these buildings would realistically also be made up of the interiors of restaurants, of technical elements, not to mention deliveries and road access. I'm adding a large road in here, and this road is a bit different because this would technically be on the inside of the park, the whole idea of Jägerhorn is to be a single area of what could have been a larger park, and given that the access road runs around the other sides of Jägerhorn, this backstage part, would actually be on the inside of the theme park. So this part is a bit more complicated, but the other backstage areas are connected to this access road and could very easily get deliveries for restaurants or whatever kind of crews down through these buildings into the park. So they're, of course, besides being an important backstage area, really also just a functional back door as well. So yeah, that's really all about why I'm building these backstage areas and why it's kind of a touch of realism, and at least I think worth building, at least to some degree. Although I have to admit that I've never gone as much into detail with my backstage stuff as I'm doing with this build. I think the last time I did even anything of this capacity was probably with Fantasy Valley, RIP Fantasy Valley, which was all really simple and really just concrete boxes with a few little AC units on it. And I do want to go a bit further with this one. Although I also have to point out, I'm still not an HVAC expert, so I'm not entirely sure how all of these AC units on top of these flat roofs would work out. So I'm mostly just placing these vents and pipes and stuff at random, sort of. Although I am basing some of it on some of the Steam Workshop items that I got. So for instance, those vents are actually Steam Workshop item, and realistically there should be an input and an output, or whatever you would technically call that, since we're talking about air here, for the air to go in and out and different parts of the HVAC. But when it comes to actual placement and things like that, yeah, I'm definitely not that knowledgeable. So to some degree, I'm really just putting stuff here. Whether it actually works or doesn't, I'm not entirely sure, but it looks believable enough, and that's what I'm basically going for. A lot of this was also quote-unquote inspired just by looking on Google Maps, and this is something that I often give as a tip whenever people ask me, you know, what inspires me. Well, for one, TED Talks. No, but no, something that is actually super useful is going on Google Maps. A lot of theme parks nowadays have 3D views, and it's extremely detailed, and you can really look into the backstage areas as well, because you're looking from an aerial perspective, of course. So what I like to do is go to Disney World, which is all in 3D, and it's glorious, and look behind some of the facades and look on the roofs, what it looks like, what kind of textures they have, what kind of HVAC elements are on the roofs, and what kind of backstage trucks and cars and everything they have. And that's really what a lot of this episode is based on as well. I'm not really copying anything per se, because the shapes and elements of these buildings are all based on the facades, which is a bit backwards, I have to say. But yeah, I think overall it works as a pretty good inspiration, and something that I like to keep open in another tab, and whenever I run out of ideas and I'm not quite sure what I want to do anymore, just look back on it for a second and you'll always find something that's like, oh, I didn't think about that, I should probably do something similar to that. Yeah. This whole approach, though, I have to say, to the backstage buildings perhaps doesn't make the most sense from a realistic chronological standpoint, because in real life you would probably design the overall shape of the building first and then kind of plaster facades over that, which is the more realistic approach, and not following that approach, but rather building the facades first and then just coming up with backstage buildings afterwards, did give these buildings, I think, a lot more depth. If you look, for instance, at a lot of Disney buildings, it's really just flat walls with so much detailing and things attached to it that they look much more dynamic and interesting. But really, when you strip all of that detail away, a lot of, for instance, the Main Street USA is just completely flat boxes. The buildings barely even have any height differences. There's really just a lot of illusions and forced perspective at play there to make it look better than it actually is. And that's something that I didn't really end up doing in Jägerhorn. I think a lot of these buildings actually do have a lot of depth to them, a lot of balconies, a lot of different orientations, a lot of buildings of different sizes. which I think looks a bit nicer, even if it is a tiny bit less realistic, or would in any case be a bit more expensive to build realistically. So this restaurant, for instance, is also, kind of weird in that sense. The front facade totally makes sense as an alpine building, I think, and really kind of has that large store or restaurant look to it. But then the backstage buildings are just based on what the front looks like, and so it's just a bunch of different shapes kind of put into each other in some strange fashion. So not really the best here, but I think it's believable. And at the end of the day, to me, the front facades looking good is still more important than the backstage buildings looking good. So yeah, there's my priorities for that one. Anyway, I have moved on to a different building. I was first adding the backstage areas to the main street, and this is the souvenir shop / restaurant that's attached to the entrance of the coaster, which is not the best placement for a gift shop, because normally they're at the end of the exit coming out of the station, because capitalism, you want people to walk through your gift shop after they get off the ride, and then they'll probably be buying some stuff. I don't know. Normally I never actually buy anything in a gift shop, but of course the odds are way higher if you force people to walk through the entire store, and then there's all kinds of psychology things at play, similar to how you divide a supermarket. But yeah, that's not something that I'm doing here, so I'm probably not going to earn too much money on this gift shop, but whatever, it's an entirely fictional gift shop anyway. But yeah, this is a building where there would be a restaurant and a gift shop, and it's completely on the other side from the main street, so I figured it would make sense to have this area be another place to buy merchandise or food, because it's quite a walk away to the other place. Not to mention that this also rounds up this area of the park quite well, because if it weren't for this building, there would really just be a wall of trees around here blocking the edge of the park, which is a bit more boring. And I do like the setting that these buildings provide and the little plaza that they create between the coaster and this building. I think with this building especially though, there will really be a sort of inside-outside disparity, because on the outside you can see these buildings with very detailed pitched roofs, and really this building is just a single building. For one it looks like multiple buildings, but in reality it's just a single blob of building. But it also actually has a flat roof, which usually backstage areas or just the theme park buildings in general tend to have flat roofs, because it's, I think, just, well, yeah, more efficient and cheap, as I pointed out earlier, but also probably just way more convenient to hoist the theming and an actual decorated area into. But I guess there is, especially here, kind of that weird mix between the outside having very clearly a pitched roof and then the inside having some kind of flat ceiling. Unfortunately, that's something that's going to have to happen. I did want to build the buildings like this though, because it's something that you typically see as backstage buildings. I do have to say though, for the main street I did have a few backstage areas that kept the pitched roofs going for a little bit after the facades. Maybe that could be some kind of entrance area for a restaurant where you could look up to multiple floors and look straight up to the roof, or something like that is what I was generally imagining. I don't have an exact roof plan for these buildings, but yeah, altogether it's weird, and it's something that I do want to acknowledge, because at the end of the day, you are very much faking things with these kinds of buildings, and you're very much creating a stage out of the theme park. And it's not per se my favorite thing to do, but I think in this park it's at least something realistic to do. This is also why, for me at least, I really appreciate when theme parks are really, really real. And to me that really adds something to a theme park. So if you go to Disney, everything is obviously fake and very commercialized, but for every building that you look at, there's just, me being somebody who has Google 3D maps all of these places, there's always just that lingering thought in your mind that it's just facades, and if you even look from a decently aerial perspective, you'll just see weird HVAC systems and concrete everywhere behind the facades, and just knowing that kind of destroys a lot of the magic, and the fact that there is magic to be destroyed is kind of a shame, you know, it's kind of inevitable, but there are theme parks that definitely do it differently and that do carry some kind of actual authentic charm. For one, I visited Tripsdrill recently, which is a park that I've wanted to visit for such a long time, and it's also one of the inspirations for Jägerhorn. Not as much, it was actually the main inspiration for Neckar Park a while ago, but even for this, it has some very charming kind of almost alpine architecture, which you find very much in the German Schwabenland, as they call it, I believe. But yeah, everything that you see in that park, or at least almost everything, is very much real. You'll see buildings that don't have these backstage areas, that are completely just plastered and timber framework and just really beautiful, traditional, charming and local architecture. There's something really cool about that, and I really just like the atmosphere that the park had. And it had buildings that you can actually walk around, because at the end of the day, the buildings in theme parks just aren't real buildings. They are just warehouses that pretend to be buildings, and on a fundamental level you can never really interact with them the same way that you would in a building. The inside and the outside really never match quite as well. You can never walk completely around it. You can never go into every space that the building has, because there's just something completely false about it, and it's really completely different from architecture. And especially theme park scenery like this is just a whole kind of beast on its own. And I've always had a lot of people ask me whether I'm an architect or something along those lines. And for one, I think video game skill doesn't really translate into real life skill. So, I mean, I don't really actually professionally do anything related to design or anything that I do in Planet Coaster. I especially don't make roller coasters, God, in mathematics, and it's really complicated, and you need all kinds of engineering degrees for that. But even then, theme park architecture is just completely different from actual architecture. It's just all design and barely any function. Which the whole design versus function debate is obviously raging in architecture, but at least architecture needs function to some degree. And in theme parks, it's mostly just design, and then the actual function is really just some warehouse that's hidden away somewhere. And it's cool to see theme parks that have actual architecture, that have some kind of local charm to them, and that's something that I really love about Tripsdrill. I highly recommend it really to anyone who's in the area who's planning some kind of theme park trip and probably hitting up Europa Park nearby. Tripsdrill is awesome. It's a really charming park. Definitely visit it if you're into the kind of South German aesthetic, or if you're into scenery-focused parks in general. And it has a decent lineup of attractions as well. Carajo is a beautiful little coaster, and God, I suck at these pronunciations, but Gesenkte Sau is also an amazing Gerstlauer bobsled that does some really awesome interactions with this castle tower that's also got a log flume in it. And that's the one building in that park that is actually very fake, because it's obviously made out of concrete, and it has a bunch of kind of backstage looking things to it. But when it comes to the whole entrance area and the old wooden mill that the park is built around, it's absolutely beautiful and really cool, and for me, quite a big source of inspiration. But then again, I want to make this park look like it would be believably a part of a Disney park or a Universal park or something like that, so I'm gonna put up with these backstage elements. Now, when it comes to hiding stuff, this is the part where a lot of the hiding begins, and where I'm also starting to add more detail to some of the areas. So at some point you have to transition from the access roads to the park itself, so I'm adding some large gates that completely block your view as well. And yeah, I'm not really expanding the park beyond this. This path here would realistically be where the rest of the park would be, where you would transition into a different themed area. But as you can see, we don't really have the space for that here. And I guess it took me 2 years to get this far on Jägerhorn. I don't know what would happen if I would try to build a full-fledged park. Yikes. Yeah, I'm sorry about this, guys. But hey, I'm trying to finish this as quickly as possible. This episode came out in less than 2 months than the last episode, which is beating my average upload rate, so I'm getting there. And speaking of getting there, this park is getting there in general. It's getting pretty close to being finished. After adding all of this backstage stuff, a lot of the sides of the park that used to be so unfinished and used to look into the wild open are completely done. Really the only thing that I still need to look into after this, this is something where I'm still kind of debating for myself how far I want to go with this, is the coaster itself, trying to fix some of the issues with it and add some more scenery here and there, because I recently did some G-force readings on the coaster and they were pretty bad. It actually hit some crazy laterals at some point. Many of the curves are criminally underbanked. I based a lot of the shaping of the coaster on Big Thunder Mountain and the Grizzly Runaway Mine Train. The only problem is that this coaster goes through the elements quite a bit faster, so a lot of the turns are underbanked, get really high lateral G-forces, and that's something where I'm still debating whether I want to fix it and have to redo a lot of things, or whether I'm just gonna keep it this way and hope that people don't care about it too much, and also, you know, keep things the way under the mantra of it's a Vekoma mine train, you're gonna get lateral G-forces, put up with it. Because realistically, that's also kind of a thing. And hell, some Vekoma mine trains are extremely overbanked. I know that Colorado Adventure Invitational Land always pushes me into the inner corner, especially on the last helix. It is really stupid how, I don't know if they did a terrible job on it or if they did it on purpose. If it was on purpose, then that's really cool, I love it, but if they did a terrible job on it, then God did they do a terrible job on the banking on that coaster. But I don't really mind. I really like it, it's part of the charm. You know, it's a Vekoma, you're gonna get banged up to some degree, and I like that a mine train is actually kind of intense, which is also part of the reason why Jägerhorn is quite intense. This thing has a few airtime moments even, which outside of Colorado Adventure is kind of unheard of for a Vekoma mine train. I'm just gonna have to look into those lateral G-forces. And then there are some other scenery stuff that I also want to look into, finishing some of the paths and also finishing the queue for the flat ride and adding something alongside that is something that I still need to do. Whatever I'm gonna end up doing, the next episode is going to be a bit of a mess because it's all just the finishing touches, but I hope you guys don't mind. For now, I'd like to thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you next time.